The bright lights of the Late Show studio were getting ready to shine on what would become one of the most talked-about interviews in late-night television history. Nobody knew it yet, but this Tuesday evening was about to change everything for everyone involved. Kash Patel sat in the green room checking his phone for the 100th time. The small waiting area backstage felt smaller than usual tonight. The walls were covered with photos of famous guests who had sat in this same room over the years. Presidents, movie stars, musicians, and politicians had all waited here before, walking on to Stephen Colbert's stage. Tonight, Patel would join that list, but not in the way anyone expected. His media team had been working on this appearance for weeks. They saw it as a golden opportunity to introduce Patel to millions of Americans who might not know much about him. As the nominee for FBI director, he needed all the public support he could get. The confirmation hearings were just around the corner, and every friendly interview could help his chances. The show's makeup artist touched up his face one more time. Patel looked good on camera. He had that clean, professional look that played well on television. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, his tie was straight, and his hair was neat. Everything about his appearance said serious government official. But inside, Patel was feeling the pressure. This wasn't his first television interview, but Colbert's show was different. The host was known for his sharp questions and quick wit. Unlike morning news shows or cable news programs, late-night comedy shows could be unpredictable. The audience was there to be entertained, not just informed. His press secretary stood nearby, quietly going over the key talking points one more time. They had practiced answers to dozens of possible questions. What's your vision for the FBI? How will you restore public trust? What changes do you want to make? These were the questions they hoped Colbert would ask. The preparation had been intense. Focus groups had tested different ways for Patel to explain his background. They practiced sound bites that would work well on social media. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. His team wanted this interview to be perfect. Down the hallway, Stephen Colbert was wrapping up his opening monologue. The audience was laughing and clapping at all the right moments. Colbert was in his element, making jokes about the day's news and getting the crowd warmed up for the show ahead. He had no idea that his next guest would soon make headlines for all the wrong reasons. Colbert's preparation had been just as thorough, but with a different focus. His research team had spent days digging through Patel's public statements, old interviews, and written records. They weren't looking for gotcha moments, but they weren't planning to throw softball questions either. This was a man who wanted to lead the most powerful law enforcement agency in America. The questions needed to match the importance of that job. The show's producers had debated how to handle this interview. Patel wasn't a typical late-night guest. He wasn't there to promote a movie or talk about his personal life. This was serious business. But it was still a comedy show, and the audience expected Colbert to be himself. Finding the right balance would be tricky. As the commercial break started, Patel's handler gave him one final pep talk. Stay calm, stick to the talking points, and remember that this is just a conversation. Millions of people would be watching, but it was important not to think about that. Just focus on having a good discussion with the host. The stage manager appeared at the green room door. It was time. Patel took a deep breath and followed him down the narrow hallway toward the bright lights of the studio. His footsteps echoed, slightly on the polished floor. Behind him, his team watched nervously from the monitors in the green room. The studio was bigger than it looked on television. Hundreds of audience members filled the seats, chatting excitedly as they waited for the show to continue. The energy in the room was electric. These people had come to see a good show, and they were ready to be entertained. Colbert's desk sat under the bright stage lights with 2 chairs positioned for the interview segment. The set looked exactly like it did on TV, but somehow more real and more fake at the same time. Everything was perfectly positioned for the cameras, but it was clearly a television set, not a real office. As Patel waited just off stage, he could hear Colbert talking to the audience during the commercial break. The host was making small talk, keeping the energy up and preparing everyone for the interview. His voice was confident and relaxed. This was his territory, his show, his audience. The floor director started counting down from 10. In just a few seconds, millions of Americans would tune in to watch what everyone thought would be a routine political interview. The cameras were ready. The lights were perfect and both men were prepared for their conversation. But preparation can only go so far. Sometimes, despite all the planning and practice, things go in unexpected directions. Sometimes two people with strong opinions end up disagreeing more than anyone anticipated. Sometimes what starts as a professional discussion becomes something much more personal and heated. Neither Patel nor Colbert knew it yet, but they were about to have one of those conversations. The kind that people would still be talking about years later. The kind that would be replayed on news shows and shared on social media millions of times. The kind that would change both of their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. The countdown reached 0. The camera started rolling. The red light came on. Colbert smiled at his audience and began his introduction. In the wings, Patel straightened his tie one more time and prepared to walk into the spotlight. What happened next would surprise everyone in that studio, everyone watching at home, and maybe even surprise Patel and Colbert themselves. But for now, in these final seconds before the interview began, everything still seemed normal. It was just another Tuesday night on late-night television. The stage manager gave Patel the signal. It was time to walk out and meet Stephen Colbert. Time to have what everyone thought would be a simple conversation about his nomination and his plans for the FBI. Time to begin an interview that would become one of the most memorable moments in late-night television history. As Patel stepped into the bright lights and heard his name being announced to the audience, he had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything would change. The careful preparation, the practiced answers, the media strategy. None of it would matter once the real conversation began. The audience applauded as he walked across the stage, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. Just another politician on another talk show, having another interview that would be forgotten by morning. But this Tuesday night was different. This interview would be remembered for a very long time. The applause filled the studio as Kash Patel walked across the stage toward Stephen Colbert's desk. The audience seemed friendly enough, clapping politely as he made his way to the guest chair. Colbert stood up with a big smile, extending his hand for a warm handshake. Everything looked normal, just like any other late-night interview. "Welcome to the show," Colbert said, his voice carrying that familiar tone that millions of viewers knew so well. "Thanks for being here tonight." Patel settled into the guest chair, adjusting his jacket and getting comfortable under the bright studio lights. The chair was positioned at just the right angle for the cameras, and he could see the audience stretching out in front of him. Hundreds of faces looking back at him, all waiting to hear what he had to say. "Thanks for having me, Stephen," Patel replied, his voice steady and confident. "Great to be here." The first few minutes went exactly as everyone expected. Colbert started with some light jokes about Washington and the FBI. He made a comment about whether FBI agents really do wear those dark sunglasses all the time, and whether they practice looking serious in the mirror. The audience laughed, and Patel chuckled along, seeming relaxed and ready to play along with the comedy show format. "So you know," Colbert said with a grin, "I've always wondered if FBI agents have to take a special class on looking mysterious. Like, is there a course called Introduction to Standing in Shadows?" Patel laughed genuinely at that one. "You know, Stephen, I think that's actually week 2 of training, right after learning to knock on doors really loudly." The audience laughed again, and for a moment it felt like this was going to be one of those pleasant interviews where everyone has a good time and nobody gets upset. Colbert's team backstage was probably feeling pretty good about how smoothly things were starting. Colbert moved on to more serious questions, but still kept things friendly. He asked about Patel's background in law enforcement and what had inspired him to want to lead the FBI. These were the kinds of questions that Patel's team had prepared for, and he had good answers ready. "I've always believed in justice and protecting the American people," Patel said, settling into his talking points. "The FBI has an important job to do, and I want to make sure we're doing it right. We need to rebuild trust with communities across the country." It sounded good, professional, responsible, exactly what you'd want to hear from someone who might soon be running the nation's top law enforcement agency. The studio audience seemed to be listening carefully, and some people were nodding along with his answers. But then something shifted. Colbert's questions started getting more specific. Instead of asking about general goals and visions, he began bringing up things that Patel had actually said and done in the past. Real quotes from real interviews and speeches. "Now, you've made some interesting comments about journalists," Colbert said, his tone still conversational but maybe a little sharper than before. "You've talked about prosecuting certain reporters. Can you explain what you meant by that?" Patel's smile became a little tighter. This wasn't one of the questions his team had hoped would come up, but they had prepared for it anyway. "Stephen, I think that's been taken out of context by the media. What I've always said is that everyone should be held accountable under the law, regardless of their job." "Right, but specifically, you mentioned prosecuting journalists who you believe have published classified information. That's a pretty serious thing to say about press freedom, isn't it?" The audience was getting quieter now. They could sense that this was moving away from the light, funny conversation they'd been enjoying. This was starting to feel more like a real interview with real consequences. Patel shifted in his chair slightly. "Look, Stephen, the First Amendment is incredibly important, but it doesn't give anyone the right to endanger national security. When classified information gets published, it can put American lives at risk. But who decides what endangers national security?" Colbert pressed. "And isn't there a difference between actual national security and just information that might be embarrassing to politicians?" That's when viewers at home started to notice the change in Patel's body language. His shoulders got a little stiffer. His jaw tightened just a bit. He was still trying to smile and stay professional, but something was clearly bothering him about the direction of these questions. "Stephen, I think you're oversimplifying a very complex issue," Patel said, his voice carrying just a hint of irritation. "The mainstream media has a long history of publishing things without considering the consequences." Colbert raised an eyebrow at that phrase. "The mainstream media? That's an interesting way to put it. Are you including this show in that category?" A few people in the audience chuckled nervously. They weren't sure if this was still part of the entertainment or if things were getting genuinely tense between the two men on stage. "I'm just saying that some outlets have an agenda," Patel replied, and now his media training was starting to slip a little. "They're more interested in attacking certain political figures than they are in reporting the truth." Colbert leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Okay, but let's talk about the truth for a minute. You've also made statements about the 2020 election. You've suggested that there were problems with how that election was conducted. What evidence do you have for those claims?" And there it was. The question that everyone in the studio somehow knew was coming, even if they couldn't have predicted exactly when. The question that would determine whether this interview stayed professional or turned into something much more confrontational. Patel's face changed noticeably when he heard those words. The polite smile disappeared entirely. His eyes narrowed slightly and he sat up straighter in his chair. The audience could feel the tension in the room ratcheting up several notches. "Stephen, that's exactly what I'm talking about," Patel said, his voice getting a little louder. "The media keeps pushing this narrative that anyone who questions election procedures is somehow a conspiracy theorist. But asking questions about election security is not the same as denying results." "But you didn't just ask questions," Colbert replied, his own tone getting more serious. "You made specific claims about fraud and irregularities, claims that courts across the country, including judges appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents, said were not supported by evidence." The studio felt different now. The friendly, joking atmosphere from the beginning of the interview was completely gone. Instead, there was this electric tension in the air, like right before a thunderstorm hits. People in the audience were sitting forward in their seats and some were looking uncomfortable. Patel was clearly getting frustrated. "Those courts didn't want to hear the evidence, Stephen. They dismissed cases on technical grounds without actually looking at what we were presenting." "But what evidence?" Colbert asked. "Because election officials from both parties, including Republicans, said they found no evidence of widespread fraud. Are you saying all of those people were lying?" "I'm saying that there are people in government who have an interest in maintaining the status quo," Patel shot back, his voice getting sharper. "And there are people in the media who are happy to help them do it." The audience was completely quiet now. This had stopped being entertainment and had become something much more serious. These weren't just two people disagreeing about policy. This was turning into a real argument about fundamental questions of truth and democracy. Colbert looked directly at Patel, and his expression was serious in a way that viewers didn't usually see on his comedy show. So when you become FBI director, if that happens, are you planning to investigate journalists and election officials based on these beliefs? That question hung in the air for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. Everyone in the studio was waiting to see how Patel would answer. His media handlers backstage were probably holding their breath, hoping he would find a way to defuse the situation and get back to safer ground. But instead of backing down or trying to smooth things over, Patel seemed to double down on his position. Stephen, the FBI's job is to investigate crimes wherever they find them. And if that includes looking into corruption in the media or in election offices, then that's what we'll do. The tension in the room was now so thick you could practically cut it with a knife. What had started as a routine late-night interview was quickly turning into something that nobody in that studio had expected to witness. The moment those words left Patel's mouth, something in the studio changed forever. You could almost feel the air get thicker, like right before lightning strikes. The audience members looked at each other with wide eyes, not sure if they should still be there or if they were about to witness something they weren't supposed to see. Stephen Colbert sat back in his chair for just a second, processing what he had just heard. His years of experience in television had taught him how to handle difficult guests, but this was different. This wasn't someone being rude or trying to be funny. This was a man who wanted to run the FBI openly, talking about investigating journalists and election officials. "I'm sorry," Colbert said, leaning forward again. "Did you just say that you would use the FBI to investigate journalists and election workers? People who are just doing their jobs?" Patel's face was getting red now. The polite professional mask he had worn at the beginning of the interview was completely gone. "Stephen, you're twisting my words. I said we investigate crimes. If someone commits a crime, it doesn't matter what their job is." "But what crimes?" Colbert pressed. "You're talking about investigating people for reporting news stories and counting votes. Those aren't crimes, Kash. Those are the foundations of democracy." The audience was dead silent now. Some people were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't what they had come to see. They wanted jokes and funny stories, not a heated argument about the future of American democracy. But they couldn't look away either. It was like watching a car accident happen in slow motion. Patel stood up suddenly from his chair. The movement was so unexpected that it startled everyone in the studio. Even the cameramen seemed surprised, quickly adjusting their shots to follow the action. Standing over Colbert's desk, Patel looked much more imposing than he had sitting down. "This is exactly the problem," Patel said, his voice getting louder with each word. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You people in the media think you're above the law. You think you can say whatever you want, publish whatever you want, and there should never be any consequences." Colbert stayed seated, but his expression was serious in a way that viewers rarely saw on his comedy show. "Kash, I think you need to sit back down. We're having a conversation here." "No, Stephen, we're not having a conversation. You're ambushing me. You're asking gotcha questions designed to make me look bad. This is exactly the kind of biased reporting that the American people are sick of." The studio felt electric now, like the air before a thunderstorm. People in the audience were looking around at each other, wondering if they should do something, or just sit there and watch. The production crew behind the cameras was probably going crazy, trying to figure out how to handle a situation they had never dealt with before. Patel started pointing his finger at Colbert, which made the whole scene even more dramatic. "You invited me here under false pretenses. You said this would be a fair interview about my qualifications and my vision for the FBI. Instead, you're attacking me with liberal talking points." Colbert finally stood up too, not backing down from the confrontation. "I'm asking you about things you actually said, Kash. These aren't gotcha questions, these are your own words. If you don't like how they sound when someone repeats them back to you, maybe you should think about what that means." "My words were taken out of context by people like you," Patel shot back, his voice getting even louder. The mainstream media has been lying about conservatives for years, and you're just another part of that machine. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Even the audience members who had been enjoying the earlier part of the interview were now looking worried. Some people near the back were actually getting up and leaving, not wanting to be part of whatever this was turning into. "Kash, you're shouting," Colbert said, trying to keep his own voice calm and steady. "This is my show, and I'm asking you legitimate questions about your fitness to lead the FBI. If you can't handle questions from a late-night talk show host, how are you going to handle the pressure of running a federal law enforcement agency?" That comment seemed to push Patel over the edge completely. His face got even redder, and he started gesturing wildly with both hands. "Don't you dare question my fitness for anything. I've served this country my entire career while you've been making jokes and spreading propaganda. I'm a comedian, Kash. That's literally my job. But you want to be in charge of the FBI, which means you need to be able to answer tough questions without losing your temper like this." The cameras were capturing every moment of this breakdown, and everyone in the studio knew that this footage would be played over and over again on news shows and social media. This wasn't just a bad interview anymore. This was a career-defining moment that would follow Patel for the rest of his life. "You're part of the deep state media conspiracy," Patel declared, his voice echoing through the studio. "You and everyone like you are working to undermine patriotic Americans who want to clean up corruption in Washington." A gasp went through the audience when they heard those words. Even in today's political climate, accusing a late-night talk show host of being part of a deep state conspiracy was pretty extreme. Some people in the audience were pulling out their phones to record what was happening, even though that wasn't supposed to be allowed. Colbert looked genuinely shocked by the accusation. "Did you just call me part of a deep state conspiracy?" "Kash, I host a comedy show. I make jokes about politicians. That's not a conspiracy, that's entertainment." "Nothing you people do is entertainment," Patel replied, still standing and still pointing. "It's all propaganda designed to destroy anyone who threatens your power structure. Well, I've got news for you, Stephen. The American people see right through it." The situation was spiraling completely out of control now. What had started as a routine political interview had turned into something that nobody in that studio had ever experienced before. Even veteran television professionals were struggling to figure out how to handle what was happening. Behind the cameras, the show's producers were frantically trying to decide what to do. Should they cut to commercial? Should they keep filming? Should they try to intervene somehow? This was uncharted territory for everyone involved. Security personnel who normally stayed invisible during tapings were starting to move closer to the stage. They weren't sure if they needed to step in yet, but they wanted to be ready just in case. The whole situation felt like it could explode into something even worse at any moment. Colbert was clearly trying to regain control of his own show. "Kash, I'm going to ask you one more time to sit down so we can finish this interview like adults." "I'm not sitting down until you admit that this was a setup," Patel demanded. "You never intended to give me a fair chance to explain my positions. This whole thing was designed to make me look bad." "You're making yourself look bad," Colbert replied, his patience clearly running out. "I'm asking you questions that any FBI director nominee should be able to answer. If you can't handle this conversation, how can anyone trust you to handle the responsibilities of that job?" That seemed to make Patel even angrier. He started walking around the interview area, gesturing wildly and raising his voice even more. "Trust? You want to talk about trust? How about we talk about whether the American people can trust a media that lies to them every single day?" The audience was completely silent now, except for the sound of people shifting nervously in their seats. Some folks were looking around for the exits, clearly uncomfortable with how heated things were getting. Others were staring in fascination, unable to believe they were witnessing such a complete meltdown on live television. Studio executives watching from the control room were probably having the worst night of their careers. This was supposed to be a simple interview with a political figure. Instead, they were dealing with what looked like a complete breakdown of professional decorum on national television. The whole situation had moved far beyond anything anyone could have predicted. What started as questions about FBI leadership had turned into accusations of conspiracy and media bias. Two grown men were essentially having a shouting match on a stage in front of hundreds of people and millions of viewers. And it was about to get even worse. Stephen Colbert had reached his breaking point. After years of hosting his show and interviewing hundreds of guests, he had never experienced anything quite like this. Standing behind his desk, watching Kash Patel pace around and shout accusations, Colbert made a decision that would shock everyone in the studio. "Okay, that's enough," Colbert said, his voice cutting through Patel's latest rant about media corruption. "This interview is over." The words hung in the air for a moment. Everyone in the studio seemed to freeze, not quite believing what they had just heard. In all the years The Late Show had been on the air, the host had never ended an interview like this. Guests might leave early sometimes, but the host didn't just shut things down in the middle of a segment. Patel stopped pacing and stared at Colbert with a look of complete disbelief. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" "I said this interview is over," Colbert repeated, his voice steady but firm. "I'm asking you to leave my stage." The audience gasped. Some people actually put their hands over their mouths in shock. They had come to see a fun late-night talk show, and instead they were witnessing something that felt more like a political crisis unfolding in real time. Patel's face went from red to almost purple. "You can't just kick me off your show. I came here in good faith and you ambushed me with gotcha questions. The least you can do is let me finish explaining my positions." "You've had plenty of time to explain your positions," Colbert replied. "Instead, you've spent the last 10 minutes shouting conspiracy theories and accusing me of being part of some deep state plot. That's not an interview. That's not even a conversation. That's just you having a meltdown on television." The cameras were still rolling, capturing every word of this unprecedented exchange. The cameramen and sound engineers had no idea what they were supposed to do. Should they keep filming? Should they cut away? Nobody had ever given them instructions for a situation like this. Patel crossed his arms and planted his feet firmly on the stage. "I'm not going anywhere until you give me equal time to respond to your attacks. You've been attacking my character for the past 20 minutes, and now you want to silence me before I can defend myself." "This isn't about silencing you," Colbert said, walking around his desk to face Patel directly. "This is about the fact that you can't handle basic questions about your qualifications without turning it into a shouting match. If you can't keep your composure during a simple television interview, how can anyone trust you to run the FBI?" The tension in the studio was so thick it was almost hard to breathe. Audience members were looking around at each other, some of them clearly wanting to leave but not sure if they were allowed to get up and walk out in the middle of filming. "I don't have to take this from you," Patel declared, pointing his finger at Colbert again. "You're nothing but a partisan hack pretending to be a comedian. The American people deserve to hear the truth, not your biased version of it." That's when the security personnel finally stepped forward. Two large men in dark suits moved onto the stage area, positioning themselves near Patel, but not quite close enough to touch him yet. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the studio. This wasn't just a heated argument anymore. This was becoming a security situation. "Sir, we need you to leave the stage now," one of the security guards said in a calm, professional voice. He was clearly trained for situations like this, even though situations like this probably didn't happen very often on late-night comedy shows. Patel looked at the security guards, then back at Colbert, then at the audience full of people staring at him. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually calm down and walk away with whatever dignity he had left. But instead, he doubled down on his defiance. "This is censorship," he announced loudly, making sure everyone in the studio could hear him. "This is exactly what's wrong with the mainstream media. They invite conservatives on their shows, ambush them with unfair questions, and then silence them when they try to fight back." The audience was completely silent now, except for the sound of people shifting nervously in their seats. Some folks were taking out their phones trying to record what was happening, even though they weren't supposed to have their devices out during filming. Colbert looked exhausted by the whole situation. "Kash, this isn't censorship, this is consequences. You came on my show, started shouting conspiracy theories, and refused to have a civil conversation. Actions have consequences, even for people who want to run the FBI." Civil conversation? Patel laughed bitterly. You call ambushing someone with gotcha questions civil? You call attacking someone's character and qualifications civil? There was nothing civil about any of this. The security guards took another step closer. They were clearly getting instructions through their earpieces from someone backstage. Probably the show's producers, who were frantically trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Sir, we really need you to come with us now, the second security guard said, his voice still polite but with an edge that suggested he wasn't going to ask many more times. But Patel wasn't done yet. I want everyone watching at home to see what just happened here, he said, looking directly into the cameras. I came here to talk about my vision for the FBI, and instead I was attacked by a biased host who had no intention of giving me a fair hearing. This is exactly the kind of media manipulation that patriotic Americans are fighting against. Colbert had heard enough. Okay, security, please escort Mr. Patel from the stage. This interview is officially over. That's when things got really dramatic. The security guards moved in closer, and Patel finally seemed to realize that this was actually happening. He was actually being removed from a television show on live television. The reality of the situation seemed to hit him all at once. This is unbelievable, he said, but his voice was different now. Less angry, more shocked. Like he couldn't quite believe that his carefully planned media appearance had turned into such a disaster. The guards didn't grab him or force him to move. They just positioned themselves on either side of him and started walking toward the exit, expecting him to walk with them. For a moment it looked like Patel might resist physically, but then he seemed to remember where he was and what was at stake. The American people will hear about this, he said as he started walking toward the wings. They'll know what really happened here tonight. They'll know that the mainstream media can't handle the truth. As Patel was being escorted off the stage, the audience sat in stunned silence. Many of them were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was news. This was history being made right in front of their eyes. Colbert stood alone on his stage, watching his guest disappear into the wings surrounded by security personnel. The host looked genuinely shaken by what had just happened. In all his years in television, he had never had to kick a guest off his show before. The studio was quiet for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then Colbert walked back to his desk, straightened his tie, and looked directly into the camera. The professional in him took over, even though he was clearly rattled by the whole experience. Well, he said, his voice a little shaky, but getting stronger with each word. That was certainly not what any of us expected tonight. A few nervous chuckles came from the audience, but mostly people were still too shocked to laugh. They were trying to figure out if what they had just seen was real, or if it was some kind of elaborate bit that they didn't understand. You know, Colbert continued, finding his footing again, I've been doing this job for a long time. I've interviewed presidents and senators, movie stars and musicians, scientists and writers. Most of the time, even when we disagree about things, we can have a civil conversation. We can talk through our differences like adults. The audience was starting to relax a little bit, grateful that their familiar host was back in control and sounding more like himself. But sometimes, Colbert went on, sometimes you meet someone who just can't handle being asked tough questions. Someone who thinks that being challenged on their views is the same as being attacked. Someone who would rather shout conspiracy theories than have an honest discussion about their qualifications for one of the most important jobs in government. The applause started slowly. Just a few people clapping, but it quickly grew until most of the audience was showing their support for their host. They had been through something intense together, and they were glad to have Colbert there to help them make sense of it. Democracy depends on accountability, Colbert said as the applause died down. It depends on people in power being willing to answer tough questions and explain their actions to the public. If someone can't handle questions from a comedian on late-night television, maybe they shouldn't be in charge of the nation's top law enforcement agency. The audience applauded again, this time more enthusiastically. They were starting to understand the bigger picture of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was a glimpse into how someone reacts under pressure, and it wasn't a pretty sight. Within hours, clips of the confrontation were everywhere. Social media exploded with videos of Patel's meltdown and his dramatic exit from the stage. News networks picked up the story and played the footage over and over again. Political commentators spent the next several days analyzing every moment of the interview, trying to understand what it meant for Patel's nomination and for American politics in general. The incident became a defining moment that followed Patel for months afterward. During his confirmation hearings, senators asked him about his behavior on the show. His supporters tried to defend him by saying he was ambushed, but many people felt that his reaction showed he wasn't ready for the pressures of leading the FBI. In the end, what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview became one of the most memorable moments in late-night television history, and not for the reasons anyone had hoped.